Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
You know, it's just a lot of area to cover for a device manufacturer to get network security right, to get web security right, to get encryption right, use the right algorithms, make sure you authenticate both ends, lock down the web interface. I mean, if you think about the percentage of IT companies that is capable of locking down a username and password field on a public-facing web application, it's a low number. So now add all these other things in addition to that, and that's the IoT security problem.
The fear-mongering that we read in the press about IoT security is really disturbing to me. I understand it's important as clickbait. And yes, it may get bad or even really bad. But as with everything else, we're going to overcome these challenges. And as with all other types of computing security, we're going to tame it and we're going to manage it. It'll never be completely under our control, but that's the nature of this cat and mouse game that's part of our reality. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Daniel Miessler about the top security risks facing IoT and how to mitigate them. This is part 2 of our 2-part interview.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com.
With me today on episode 30 is Daniel Miessler. We are on part 2 of a 2-part podcast series on IoT security. Daniel is principal architect with HP Fortify and has over 15 years of information security experience across the network, web, mobile, and IoT spaces. In the last 10 years, his specialty has been in penetration testing. His current focus is on standardizing security testing for IoT, and he is the creator and leader of the OWASP IoT project. Daniel, good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so where we left off, if we remember, is the current state. I think you were giving it a D or an F, but we both agreed that, hey, you know, it's pretty early days, and it'll make its way up. And we were going through the major findings of your studies, and we made it through the first 3. So let's go on to number 4. So just to recap, we had web interfaces, you know, that is in particular the authentication. We had unencrypted connections, and to summarize, very high level. Just make sure you're doing it properly, and if you do it properly, it is encrypted. And then our third one was weak update systems, and I think the first point was you need one. That's going to help. And then if you do one, then there's a few things not to do and to follow, in particular FTP, or I guess just using clear text, you know, protocols that don't use clear text, and signing, and a few other things. So you'll need to listen to the previous show to hear the first 3 if you haven't already. So let's get on to number 4. What was your number 4 finding?
Yeah, I would say the next big one is privacy. So it definitely blurs into the others.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's worth talking about on its own. It's basically the idea that consumers, or whether it's a private home consumer or even a corporation, there's not that much understanding right now when they start entering data into a device or into an IoT system or ecosystem, what's being done with that data. I think there's still quite a bit of an assumption that, it's being encrypted. It's being sent only to the legitimate vendor backend and no one else. And the reality is quite a bit different. Oftentimes they're asking for things that are, pretty important for people, date of birth and, you can see salary information, all sorts of very strange questions that are often asked because oftentimes it's a marketing driver, right? For all of this, for the IoT ecosystem, right? They usually have other products that they're trying to sell, not just the one that you did purchase. So they're trying to gather as much data as possible. And then the question is, where is that data going? What is being done with it? So one of the things we look at very carefully is where all does the IoT system connect to as part of its regular use. So what we do internally at HP and what we recommend that others do, the manufacturers in particular, is, use the system and document all the various connections that are made and particularly look for, is it going to an ad network? Is it going to an analytics network or some other third party that's pulling this very sensitive data? And even worse, not using encryption when doing so.
Right. Now, are you finding this, on the consumer side, consumer IoT, definitely. Are you finding this on the commercial, industrial, infrastructure side of IoT as well?
This is mostly on the commercial side that we're seeing this.
It is. Yeah. Okay. And so I guess from an advertising point of view, you're saying that they're looking for that information on the enterprise, or how is that working, from a commercial point of view? Or do you know what I mean? I'm thinking, for the products, the IoT products that you were examining, were those IoT products consumer IoT products, or were they being used more in business?
Yeah, we focus on the consumer side. Of course, that line blurs quite a bit with a lot of corporations actually deploying some of the same systems, right?
Yeah.
But the same issue would apply to either.
Okay. Now, you brought up the tool that you released at DEF CON that was, displaying, I suppose, the different services that the IoT product was connecting to. Now that's good. I think that's important, that you want to know, in real time where the information's going. But I guess, specifically from a privacy point of view, you don't have an insight as to, once they've collected the data, even if they don't do it in real time, they can do other things with it, right? There's no real technical way to track that, or is there?
Well, yeah, not really. You've got a few things you could potentially do, follow up with the company and say, hey, I noticed my data was sent to you. But this is all assuming quite a bit. There aren't too many people who are going to go home and set up a webcam, bust out TCP dump and start looking at packets to see what's happening with their privacy data. It's just not super practical. But let's assume that they did. Their recourse is to send an email to support@vendor.com and say, hey, I noticed, I sent my data to a bunch of third parties that you evidently work with. Can you be really careful with that data, please? There's just so few options there.
Now, are there any, data privacy watchdogs that are online that are kind of advocates for consumers in this way? Yeah,
one in particular is the FTC, and they've been pretty vocal and active in the IoT space.
Yeah, they have actually.
Yeah, and I think one of their big things really is the privacy side. So I would definitely put them on that list.
Now, on privacy technically, so, privacy and there's a lot to talk about, obviously, on the privacy side. But since we're in it, there's a division between the technical, what you can do technically, and then policies, just rules that you define within the company. I don't want to talk about the rules part, but I do want to talk about the technical part. What is the state of the art in privacy tech? I don't know a better way to put that. Is there privacy tech, or is it all rule based? Kind of the rules that you make yourself. And I'm talking from the perspective of an IoT product developer. So they're thinking, okay, well, I'm going to be releasing a product, is there a way to technically help on the privacy, or no? It's just up to them. The onus is on them. Often is to protect the privacy of the data from other people in the organization. But is there anything technically that's available for product makers to help with privacy, or is it all just something that you decide on and you just follow?
Yeah, I don't think there is, because really that becomes a security conversation, right? So when you're protecting the privacy data, you're actually using something like SSL, which is now a security technology. Really, right. The piece you're talking about really comes in at the product design, product requirements / business level, right? Where the business says, hey, in order to help, help pay for this product or to expand our ecosystem or whatever, we're going to ask for these following 7 fields. And then they say, here are the fields to the developer to go and collect from the user, right? And then they code that into the web app. So the whatever controls on what privacy data is captured would have to take place in between the business giving that requirement to the developer.
Okay. All right. So, but that's helpful then. At least it clarifies things in my mind. When we're talking about privacy, we're talking about rules and generally rules that an enterprise will put into place to follow themselves. But then when we're talking about technology, we're talking about the security side. So security is going to be on the tech side. Privacy is going to be on the the internal rules side. Is that a good way to kind of break the two? Or separate?
Potentially. I mean, like I think we talked about in the previous show, I think when it gets to the ground, when it gets to actual network traffic moving, I think it blurs a lot more, because basically if you have a leak of information, if you have a leak of data, let's say it's a sensitive application, let's say it does some sort of energy measurement and calculation. Let's say that's sensitive data, and it just left to the internet unencrypted, right? Well, that would be a data leakage of type intellectual property or of type sensitive or whatever they tag that as. And then if the next packet that goes out has, Jane Doe, date of birth so-and-so, medical condition so-and-so, that would simply be another data leakage issue, possibly also critical, but it would simply be another security problem. And that's the way the pen testing or the audit side sees it. So at that point, you would have a collapsing of the privacy and data leakage. It would just be, these are both really important types of data. One is privacy and PII related, and the other is, intellectual property or internal information related.
Okay. No. So what you're saying then is privacy, to a certain extent, is a subset of security. Am I understanding?
That's how it's seen in some contexts. What's really fascinating, though, is you go into different spaces. Actually, I was talking with Josh Corman about this. I'm also part of a medical security group that's also associated with I Am the Cavalry. And it's really interesting. They would go into, they were, from my space, information security, and they would go to these different vendors and have conversations in hospital staff and such and say, we're going to talk about security. And they say, you mean safety? And we're like, no, not safety. This is not safety. This is security. And their entire world has a different understanding of these words.
Right.
So it's really interesting that the way you're breaking it down versus the way I'm breaking it down versus the way someone in medical might break it down. So it could be that we have to sort of unwrap some of these terms in order to get a level set.
Yeah. No, I think it's just, again, a big part of, the audience that listens to the show
Absolutely.
are they're technical, but but not all of them are super technical. And so, I'm trying to provide a framework for thinking about this. And up to this point, I've been thinking of them sort of separately. But you're making a good point separately. But you're making a good point that privacy is part of security. I think I can see your point of view, and I'm just wondering if it's a semantic issue or if it's more than that. I don't know.
Well, just think of it in terms of, this is the way I look at it, is when you have an actual product installed, it's actually serving a business function, and an abuse takes place, right? An actual thing will happen. An actual thing you don't want to happen does happen. How does it take place, and what are the ramifications? And that's kind of the context that the pen testing side comes at it from, right? Whereas another industry or another type of space, they might have a completely different risk profile because they're not thinking about hacking. Maybe they're not even worried about it. Maybe it's a purely legal issue. So that's why they may use the terms differently.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I don't want to get stuck on this, but it's interesting to me. And I think, that's where we are in the evolution of IoT right now is sorting out the semantics of all this so we can all interface with each other, I suppose, when we're talking about it. But all right, I don't want to bog us down there. That was number 4. What are we talking about for number 5?
Yeah. So another one that we've seen some issues with is around insecure network services.
Okay.
And these are just more familiar to more different types of security people. These are open ports on IoT devices that either give up information or allow interaction. Oftentimes, there's an assumption of security behind the firewall, right? If it's not internet facing, then how bad could it be? And we've had some examples where we've been able to connect to a device and actually be dropped right into a root prompt with no username and no password. And now we have full control over the device. You can browse to what data is on the device, and that sort of thing. And it's definitely something we think needs to be taken seriously.
No, and it's also something that's known, right? I mean, if you're talking about network, insecure network surfaces, this is in the area of network security, and this is an area that's been around for 20, 30, whatever number of years, right? So, I mean, again, there's no unknowns here. Or are there anything particular? Is there, I guess maybe a question is, from a network security point of view, I can think of one, but are there any considerations that are different when talking about an IoT network versus, let's say, a broadband network or, I guess an IOP, Internet of People network? Yeah,
no, it's interesting you say that. So one of the attack surfaces that we have in the attack surface project is actually IoT scoped authentication and access control. So this is separate from the mobile app. It's separate from the web interface that runs on the device. It's also separate from the web interface that runs on the cloud interface. Right. And so imagine you have all these components and you have, I don't want to use the word too loosely here, but you have like an emergence of a separate thing. Instead of being the collection of things, which you also do have to test individually, that's why we have the surface areas project, you also have looking at the system as a whole. And from a security standpoint, this is really crucial because what you could possibly see are things like the mobile app trusts this other device component that's inside of the network, or the network automatically trusts the mobile app because it authenticated before and now it's sending this static token. So it's like you're not just testing them individually, but you have to test how they all interact together. And so,
good point.
So I would say that's another. It is another way to look at the network security side, in that how does every other component in the IoT system interact with that particular network component? But the network component itself, like you said, that is that's kind of been a known issue for a long time. And it goes back to the problem we talked about in the previous installment, is that, it's just a lot of area to cover for a device manufacturer to get network security right, to get web security right, to get encryption right, use the right algorithms, make sure you authenticate both ends, lock down the web interface. If you think about the percentage of IT companies that is capable of locking down a username and password field on a public-facing web application, it's a low number. That one tiny thing, just doing that correctly, is hard. So now add all these other things in addition to that, and that's the IoT security problem.
Yeah. Okay. So there's two things I want to talk about here. So the first one is good point. I mean, the system point, because an IoT product is not a product. It's a system. Yep. And you made the point rightly earlier, and I think that's a big takeaway from the previous episode is IoT security is mobile security, it's network security, it's application security, and what you're saying now, it's system security, right?
Absolutely.
You're saying, and I like that's a good point, because the dependencies, you might get lazy and you might just assume, between these three, I don't know if they're layers of security, but these three components of security, if you just get lazy and maybe depend on what they've done and mobile's done for network or application is done for mobile, I guess this can go either which way. Then you can have system security problems, and I'm not sure. I mean, are there any best practices to look at, or is this kind of a case by case basis of how to approach? Because I think there's best practices for mobile and network and application security. What about for system security? Is this something you're addressing, or is it still kind of like the next thing to address?
No, it is something that we're incorporating. In fact, in that particular surface area, we're trying to incorporate exactly that. So here's one example of previous pen tests where we've seen a difference between one interface and another. So say, for example, a cloud security provider that when you log in through the web page, it requires two-factor authentication, right?
Yep.
Well, what often happens is that same company also has a mobile app. And
exactly,
that's a separate project. Like, they often have a separate IT team working on it. Maybe they talk, maybe they don't. But many different mobile applications, you can log into that same web interface without the second factor.
Oh, you mean they just save the second factor? The password?
No, they look password? At the user agent, they see that it's a mobile app, and they say, oh, we don't have that requirement yet for the mobile app, which means we just pivot over, we change our user agent on the website to a mobile application, and now it doesn't require two-factor authentication either.
So which doesn't require the two-factor authentication? You're saying when you're signing into the cloud, or when you're signing into the mobile?
The mobile. So
the mobile, because you've already done it on the cloud.
No, it's worse than that. It's just because it's inconvenient to do it on the mobile side.
So they assume it's being done elsewhere and not doing it at all?
Well, they just lower the standard for the mobile app.
Oh,
even though they're authenticating to the same exact system. And this is, we've seen this quite a bit. It's not everyone, but this is an example, and we've seen this many times, where if you're coming from the internal web device, the internal web app, you get one standard. If you're coming from the mobile app, maybe it's slightly different and it's different authentication, or maybe it just lets you write in. If you're coming from the cloud, it's different. So one of the recommendations is to make sure that when you have a security standard, all the various clients that use that interface have to be held to the same standard.
Makes sense. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it gets down to a certain extent to, I guess, to laziness, right? I mean, or maybe assumptions. Is that a more complimentary way to put it?
I would say business function, pushing, if they get enough emails on the mobile side saying, I hate your mobile app because of this component, they're like, well, let's just lower that standard for the time being. Oftentimes, user response, drives that sort of thing. Other times it's just that it's a completely separate team working on the project, and they did not communicate, and they didn't realize the standard was as high for both interfaces. And that's an example of where the system, the overall auth system, has to be viewed separately from how are you talking to it.
Mm-hmm. And are there any? I mean, we've come up with a couple components. Obviously, there's the mobile component of the product. There's the network component of the product. Are we including the application component of the product? So the cloud, I guess, is going to be part of the application or the network component, number one. And then two, are there any other components that were the interface to the cloud, the interface to the network? What else is that covering it all? I mean, from a system point of view.
Well, I mean, there are 16 of them. So, I mean, I could go through a few of them if you want to. But so ecosystem access control, that's the meta one that I told you about. So implicit trust between components, enrollment security, decommissioning a system. So that's a really important one for an IoT ecosystem is how do you take a component out of the system? How do you make sure it's not able to re-enroll? How do you authenticate a system as being part of the ecosystem, that sort of thing? But I'll just read through some of these real fast. Device memory, device physical interfaces. So firmware extraction, user command line, admin command line, privilege escalation. Another one, device web interface, device firmware, device network services. We've talked about these. Okay. Administrative interface. This is really interesting. You could have a separate administrative interface. That could be a thick client that sits somewhere else.
Right,
or some
the back end. Yeah.
Absolutely, or some separate client that you download, and maybe even it's a web client. But it could control the entire ecosystem separate from talking to the device, or this device, or that device, or this sensor, or that sensor.
Yep. No, often there will be that back end. I mean, you're going to have it for the actual owner of the product, let's say, or the provider of the product, or just the network administrator of the product, so they can go in and see what's going on and change things. So you're saying it's another way into it, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, and that's the name of the game when you think about the attacker space or the pen testing space. Is we're looking for situations where someone spends 4 months hardening this one particular attack surface. And then we sort of walk in and say, hey, are there any other clients? And they say, oh, yeah, there's this interface. Oh, what's the username and password? Oh, it's still admin and admin. No one changed it. And you Google for the product online. And it's got admin in the PDF that describes how to do the setup. Right? So it's walk through the front door when the back windows have bars on them.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go to. Are you finished? Is there 5, or are there more findings that you want to go over?
I think that's most of the big ones, and a lot of them, as you saw, they cross into each other. But those are the main ones.
Those are the main ones. So, I guess the other thing I want to talk about is kind of this balancing, and I think it is more of a business. It's more of a business, I guess, decision than a technical one. But I can tell you that the projects that I'm personally involved in, because I have a couple clients that are actually that I'm advising, that are building IoT products. And when we get down to it, when we get down to the decision making, you only have so many resources. You only have in time or money. It seems like security always becomes less important than the next feature. And I know we're early days, and I know security is, on one side, security obviously has a lot of visibility, as we were saying in the last episode, by the press. But on the other side, to sell products, it seems like features are doing that more than security. I just wanted to get your perspective on that. I mean, is just where we are in the evolution of IoT product development? Have you seen this as well? What's your perspective on just basically security, the importance of security, I suppose, is maybe another way of putting it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's really hard to talk about, say, that these attack surface areas and then say, well, how do you get this to the consumer, for example? Like, when are you going to go to Best Buy and have a rating on the product for the various surface areas, or maybe there's A through F or some sort of standards body? Like, how do you get the advice? How do you get people to care? That's what it comes down to. How do you get people to care? And I think the basic answer is that it'll probably come from two different directions. It'll come from above and it'll come from below. And below, with the manufacturer being in the middle, okay? So below would be customers demanding it. And that would come in the form of media articles saying, so-and-so, this event just happened, and it happened because of IoT. You know, some person saw something inside of a house, or they took control of a blender and hacked China, or whatever it is, right? So the consumer sees these things and starts looking for some sort of security language on the front of the box. So that would be motion or pressure from the bottom. I think what's more likely to happen, and they will happen simultaneously, but what's more likely to make a difference is when groups like the FTC and other government groups and even industry standards put together a list, and they say to the manufacturers, you know, these are the minimums, and you really have to make sure that these steps are taken if you want to ship a secure product. And then, you know, down the line as things mature, maybe there are ramifications, or maybe those ramifications start to blend into the bottom pressure of, hey, consumer, did you know that they did not reach this standard, right? So a combination of that pressure from regulation, industry, compliance, pushing down, and the consumer simply saying, I want a more secure product, will ultimately change the balance between that business requirement of get the feature out. Well, ultimately, security will start to become part of the business balance.
Absolutely,
right? But I think we're a little ways from that, because the visibility and the understanding is not quite there with the consumer. Quite honestly, it does require things to happen, right? If no one ever hears about an IoT security incident, it's going to be really hard to say, you know, you don't want to have this happen when they've never heard of this.
Sure. No, that's how rules are made. It's generally after the fact. Yeah. No, so what you're saying then, it is really a function of time, and it's just that that's where we are right now, and just wait, whether government's going to get involved or the end consumer is going to get involved when something happens, then that'll just force it. But it just doesn't look as sexy right now. I suppose, you know, that product marketing manager who, you know, wants the best for his product or her product, at least right now, just where we're at, it just doesn't seem to be there. Yeah,
and I think there's probably one more force, which does come from the middle, which is a forward-thinking PMM or even engineering group that says, you know what, we want to have our differentiator be security. And you could potentially argue that that's happening now with some of the ecosystems that are coming out, with certain vendors saying, we have really strict security requirements. If you're going to sell in our store, you know, you need to make sure you reach the standard, or else you will not be on the shelf.
Right. Yeah. Or, you know, and maybe another perspective is, you know, we were talking about ecosystems, and it's a bit of an overloaded term, but we can use ecosystem as multiple companies coming together to solve one problem. And similarly, the owner of that ecosystem, or the platform that others are building upon, they can also set these standards. And to a certain extent, I think that's a best practice, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's shift into best practices a little bit. I mean, we've gone through the 5 main, discoveries, you know, or findings from the study or studies. And, you know, and you're saying, geez, you know, it is really tough doing this, but let's provide some guidance for the audience as to, I think you've talked about them directly and indirectly, but what are some best practices, you know, when you're building your IoT product? That could be a product, infrastructure, you know, environment, whatever the case may be. But when you're building that IoT product, what are some best practices that you should follow I know it's difficult, but we need to provide some advice here.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, each of these areas, the attack surface areas, has within it the top vulnerabilities that can come from that. And what we're looking to do is expand that out into, here's the best way to defend against that. So, I mean, right now, there's not too much guidance there. There's a new IoT trust framework that
I'm liking that.
yeah. that HP and we're looking to interact with them to some degree. We're trying to get some good guidance around that. The OWASP project that we lead is a really good source of information for that. It's very tangible and practical, and it's context-based. So most importantly, if you're the manufacturer and you're dealing with poor physical security or insecure software and firmware or privacy concerns, what are these three things that you definitely want to avoid? And that's a pretty low bar, but it'll get you pretty far ahead compared to the mistakes that are capable of being made.
So you're talking about, again, of those five, I guess, findings then that we were just talking about.
So actually more like the 16 attack surfaces.
Ah, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for a manufacturer who's building a car, or they're building a thermostat or whatever it is, here are the different ways that your device can be abused. Make sure you're not doing these things, which are the top ways that they do get abused. Right.
And then you're saying you're going to be providing a little bit more guidance, one step down for each of these attack surfaces and what you should do. So the best practice would be identify what these 16 attack surfaces are and try to comply at least, you're saying maybe the top three or the low-hanging fruit in each of these. But is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and this is a very, the OWASP approach is a very practical, free, immediately available approach. For larger companies that have larger portfolio of devices, we recommend you reach out to someone, right? There's another group called Build It Securely, headed by Mark Stanislav and Zach Lanier. It's also a sister project of the OWASP project. And what they do is they take very small businesses and they link them up with a security researcher. And that researcher, interacts with them, goes through a list similar to like the OWASP project and says, hey, here are your low-hanging fruit. You definitely want to get these fixed before you go live. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. And then on the corporate side, we have a whole practice around helping people build security into their products as a manufacturer from the very beginning, from the requirements phase, from the design phase, all throughout using static tools, dynamic tools, threat modeling, and all that kind of stuff. So it all depends on how large your portfolio is, how many apps you need to secure. And it ranges all the way from getting a quick hit from the OWASP project on, wow, I need to make sure I don't do these 7 things, all the way to, changing your SDL to include security.
Yeah, no, okay. No, that makes sense. And, I guess also where I'm going is, you were making the point earlier that it's really tough to do this in all the 3 different areas. And then we also came up with the 4th one or identified the 4th one being the system security. So what about the approach? I mean, obviously manufacturers don't have infinite resources to apply to this. So how do you approach this? I mean, do you have to hire an external help to do this? Because you even identified it earlier. You've got maybe 1 or 2 programmers that have some security expertise, but I'm just trying to. You're right. So go to there, but now the next step, we've now identified it. Well, how do you approach this? I mean, because it seems like it's almost an overwhelming, or is it? Maybe it's not.
Yeah. So there's multiple levels, right? There's what can you do right now if you have a bright group of people who are security minded but don't have the knowledge. You can send them something as quick as an OWASP list like we have. And if it's a larger portfolio, they're very understaffed, then it's a question of, do we staff someone up? Do we grow the security team and teach them these concepts and then have them do it for the org? Or do they go to an outside group like an HP and say, hey, we just really need help. We need to build all of your products and services into our SDL. And we're doing the whole range. On the HP side, we're seeing the entire range across customers. And on the OWASP side, we're seeing a lot of people benefit from that. So I think it's a matter of, like you said, how many resources do you have? How many applications or products or systems are in the portfolio? And what are the capabilities, and where do I drag and drop the right solution?
Yeah. Okay. And I think the first, like we're saying, the first tangible, I'm just saying, from a manager that is a product manager, let's say, that is saying he wants to set, a certain level of security. I think, like you're saying, the OWASP kind of lays out those 16 attack surfaces. And then it's a matter of implementing, is going through each of them and implementing them within your product. Now, how they're implemented, are there separate, you kind of touched on this with HP, but are there separate products that help you with each of these attack surfaces? Is this something that you're doing custom? You're just following, best practices and you're coding it yourself? And give us a bit of a flavor of how you can mitigate against these 16 attack surfaces. What's the, what are the tools that you as a manufacturer or a company has, an enterprise has, to mitigate against these attack surfaces?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a mix, right? There's a mix there of some of these best practices are easily described in a code snippet that could be put on the OWASP site. Okay. Other best practices include doing, say, source code testing, right? Which would be more of an enterprise tool that a larger company would have. Most importantly would be, how do you design throughout your build process the appropriate amount of security and security testing types to occur in each of those sections, right? And that's really where an HP or someone like that would help them build that into it. But it's a matter of, for each one of those, what is the best possible thing I could do given the resources that I have? And really, that's the conversation that has to happen in order to know how to move forward.
Okay. No, that makes sense. Now, my last question is going to be on, these attack surfaces. If you squint your eyes, an IoT product / system, as we know, whether it's in the consumer space or the industrial space or the infrastructure space, commercial space, they all pretty much work the same way. They're just maybe bigger or smaller components of each of the main components of that system. Are these recommendations, are they different if you're working on a consumer product versus a commercial product, or is it pretty much the same everywhere?
Yeah, the goal is really to make it the same. There could be potential differences, and where they are there, we're going to try to take them out. We're going to try to make it so that this works on a 5 million node ICS system or SCADA system, the same way they would apply to a smart TV. The idea is to have them be as universal as possible so that they could become as standardized as possible as far as a checklist for building security in.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, because the technology is the same, it's just used in bigger or lesser or greater extents, depending on the application. Now, are you dealing with any of the consortia that are out there now? For example, the OIC or the All-Seen or the Industrial Internet Consortium, because I know they all, we've had them on our show, and they all have a security component. But we need to have everyone kind of standardize on the same page. Is this another place that our listeners, if they're part of these groups or considering to be part of these groups, is this another place where this standardization is happening, or is it all diverting, or is this a solution or a problem? Having the different consortia out there now with respect to security.
Yeah, I don't see how it could be bad. I mean, you're right. There's so many people having separate conversations, but I feel like that's just a necessary motion to get us farther ahead. Eventually, the conversations will, collapse and fold into each other and become more unified. But for the time being, I think this is just it's growing pains. And, HP is definitely involved in a lot of those conversations.
Absolutely. All right, growing pains, I agree with you. Daniel, great. How can people find out more about, what you're working on, what HP is working on, specifically in the IoT space?
Yeah, absolutely. So the OWASP project, you could just Google for OWASP Internet of Things project, and it should be the first hit. You can also look for attack surfaces, OWASP IoT attack surfaces. And again, it'll have all the information there for sort of practical advice. And on the HP side, I believe there's a landing page for the IoT effort in general. I don't have the URL. I could send it to you.
Yeah, no, we'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. But you just Google for HP IoT. You should find it there as well.
Excellent. Well, thanks for this. We've only done this twice so far, but thanks for this 2-part podcast. I appreciate it, and we'll be talking soon.
All right. Thanks so much.
Okay. That was again a good talk with Daniel Miessler. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support this show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is Risk Assessment for the Internet of Things with Paul Dant of Independent Security Evaluators. I hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Till next week, may your path to IoT business be a secure one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.